Now it's time to welcome our first keynote, Mark Farmer, founder of Consultancy, a name I'm sure is familiar to many of you. Mark has over 35 years experience in the construction industry and is widely recognised for authoring the landmark 2016 government review, Modernise or Die. From 2019 to 2023, he was the government's champion for modern methods of construction in house building, and in 2023 he was also appointed by the Department for Education to lead a review of the construction industry training boards, which was published in January 2025. So please join me in welcoming Mark to the stage.
Thank you, Lindsay, and good morning everyone. It's great to be back here in Scotland and great to support BEST in this fantastic forum talking about scalable solutions. So in thinking about what I was going to talk about, I sort of gravitated towards where I've spent a lot of my time over the particularly last 2 or 3 years, which is in the skills arena. So I really wanted to focus on the skills, training, human capital side of the equation, perhaps to set the scene in the context for broader discussions that are going to follow today and tomorrow. So I've entitled this presentation 15 or 20 minutes, then taking questions. Strategic workforce planning in an age of uncertainty. And that might sound a bit of a mouthful, but actually there's a very important message that I want to really land as part of what I want to talk to you about. And it sort of starts with the prepositioning that we always talk about having a skills crisis in construction, and that in reality sometimes it's overblown, but we know that there's a problem with investment in human capital in the construction industry, and it's not accidental. It comes about by virtue of the fact the trading conditions within which we operate are really difficult, they're really tough, and actually that drives human behaviours in terms of decisions to invest in skills and training. And that very much is driven by the fact that our industry revolves around a project-based pipeline model. So there's very little certainty for the mid to long term in relation to revenues. We're always looking for the next job. If you're lucky, there might be a programme of work, but that's usually the exception, not the rule. So we're always hunting a next order. And that really has shaped the way the industry has started to structure itself, particularly in the last 40 to 50 years in this country. So since the 1970s in particular, as the post-war investment in housing and infrastructure started to tail away and the industry became more and more reliant on private sector investment, the economic cycles that have flowed since the 70s have really driven the industry towards being conservative, devolving responsibility for employment, hence subcontracting, and the move towards fragmenting our supply chains, and that in turn has also reflected itself in our employment models, which is very much around transient labour, high level of self-employment, as well as subcontracting at the specialist trade level. And that effectively goes to the heart of why we have a skills problem in our industry. And if you look at what that means in reality, so taking Scotland, the ups and downs of workload are pretty apparent, and you effectively are constantly riding the wave of what's going on in the macroeconomic backdrop. So this is house building. Unfortunately, where we end up at the moment, and it's probably reflective of the broader picture in the UK at the moment, is on a downward slope. So the last 3 years in particular, I would say in the UK have been a really good example of hollowing out in a downward cycle in the industry, and what negative impacts that has around long-term decisions, which include investment in people and skills and training, apprenticeships, etc., etc., etc. And it's the same with overall workload. So beyond housing, just looking at the whole of construction output in Scotland, again, cyclical, and at the moment on a downward slope. So what happens when you have that kind of cyclicality? The headlines speak for themselves, as you can see here. So over the last 3 or 4 years in particular, we have had what I would characterise as a real derailment of progress that was actually to the point, probably up to 2022, we were actually making some significant headway around trying to think differently about how we build, thinking differently about skills, thinking differently about investments. And ultimately, that was supported by the fact we were on an upward trajectory around workload. Even COVID, arguably, didn't really derail things. There was a very short hiatus, but we got building again. The government gave us critical industry status, and actually, if anything, there was a bit of a boom. But post-2022, we've really suffered. And all of these headlines that span both training, but also a lot of the derailment relates to emerging parts of things like industrialisation, so MMC. So we had an emerging volumetric housing market in the UK, particularly in England. That pretty much has failed. That whole segment has failed because actually when the market went back and demand diminished, an immature market couldn't support the cost of investment in factories, etc., that have been building to that point. So we've done a lot of damage, to be quite frank. And when it coming back to skills, which is the key part of what I want to talk to you about, what we have is what I would term the Achilles heel of how we operate and how we behave, which is this short-termism, driven by that cyclicality that you don't want to be left holding the baby of having too much payroll or too much fixed investment when your market is going up and down, particularly when it's going down. So short-termism prevails. That affects behaviours in relation to what we're all prepared to invest as businesses, and it's obviously ultimately a personal decision from leaders of businesses as to what they want to do, and I'm not going to overgeneralise because there's some great examples of good work which I'll come on to, but just at a macro level, these are the issues. We have short-termism. We also have a concept of free riding, where some businesses rely on others to do the heavy lifting around that investment in people. And unfortunately, it's not a blame game, but it's just the reality of what happens. So this cyclicality point is really important. And I'm a big advocate of trying to give the industry much more of a sort of forward look as to what's coming. And I have to say the best example I've seen in the UK, if not anywhere actually, including internationally, of trying to address that problem is here in Scotland. So this, many of you will know, is the pipeline forecasting tool that Scottish Futures Trust has generated. This is a really good piece of work. And you know, hats off to Peter Reiki and the team at SFT that this is something that actually I'm trying to promote south of the border in relation to pipeline planning. NISTA, the National Infrastructure Service Transformation Authority, has just done a pipeline tool. I don't think it's as good as this. And actually, this is a really good way of giving the industry a bit of a heads up as to what might be coming. So it gives visibility. Unfortunately, what it doesn't do, it doesn't give you certainty that all the projects that are listed on that pipeline are going to happen, because some of them may have planning permission, but they're not funded. They're subject to house builders pressing the button on rate of sale. They're subject to investors making decisions on capital investment plans, etc. But this is a pretty good start, and you know it's happening here in Scotland. Just to sort of put in context this skills challenge from a policy positioning point of view. So it's pretty clear at the moment that the politicians out there are still playing what I call high-vis bingo. So any opportunity for a photo shoot at a factory, on a construction site, with a trowel, they're there. Both sides of the border. And I think that's probably good, because what it shows is that the politicians are interested in our industry and they recognise the importance of our industry. But, you know, does that ultimately make a difference to our welfare? Arguably, you know, we're no better off, but there's been lots of activity. And where that activity, certainly for the last couple of years, I would suggest maybe 18 months, has focused is things like the planning system. So in house building, the politicians have decided that the big blocker is planning is too difficult, which undoubtedly it is. And lots of the policy decisions, both sides of the border, have been about deregulating planning. But actually, I think they're also recognising it's not just about planning. It's much more about broader investment confidence. It's about viability. So here in Scotland, you've had your housing bill resolved in the last few weeks, which is good because that's created a bit of a hiatus around investment, particularly in residential. In England, we've had a bit of a wake-up call. London's residential market's pretty much collapsed in the last 2 years. So politicians are now responding to other forms of stimuli beyond just planning, which is a good thing, but it remains to be seen as to whether it starts to ride the upward cycle of the waves that I've already shown you. If we were to solve all of that, we still come back to this point of do we have a workforce fit for purpose and with sufficient capacity to deliver the economic growth that politicians are expecting? And it's fair to say, you know, just looking at these headlines, that there's a real challenge around whether that's the case or not. I don't think there's ever a case of can we physically not build it. I think the issue is more to the point of, you know, the industry would always do what it's given, and it will try its best, but it will increasingly fail. So it's a qualitative issue that the more we overload the industry, the worse the results get, whether it's cost, time, quality. It's not an absolute binary debate. And it's also made worse by the fact we're not just standing still. So the broader backdrop, the regulatory backdrop, particularly around sustainability, probably quite rightly, is that it's getting tougher to build stuff. The technical standards to which we're required to build are becoming more difficult. That has skills implications, so that we're putting more and more pressure on a workforce that's already stressed. So it's a double whammy in many respects. From a Scotland perspective, you know, what's really interesting if you look at the numbers, and this is a SDS sectoral assessment from last year, is that yes, there is a need to expand the workforce. We keep talking about skills gaps, and I try and differentiate between skills gaps and workforce gaps. Workforce gaps for me is quantum. Skills gaps is more about the alignment of competencies and skills within that quantum of workforce. But in Scotland, what this is suggesting is up to 2034, actually the bigger problem is not expansion, it's replacement. So there's 3 or 4 times as many people needed just to replace people retiring than to actually support the growth of the industry over that period. And that's a sort of a real stark reminder of the challenges we have around demographics and need to really face into this human capital problem, because it's unlike bricks and windows and stuff, you can't just manufacture skilled workers. That's the thing, you can't turn it on and off. We're talking about long-term trending positions here. And also the other thing is that it's not just a replacement, it's reskilling is the other challenge that exists within these numbers, which I'll come on to in a second. As Lindsay said in the intro, I was asked by the Department for Education back in 2023 to conduct a review of the industry training boards, both construction and engineering construction training boards, which got me diving pretty deeply into the whole world of skills, which is why I wanted to talk about it today. Lots of people, the ITBs are quite an emotive subject area. Lots of people are very anti-CITB, don't see the value for money, don't see the levies being effective, don't see what they're getting for their money. My recommendations suggested we should stick with it, but it needs a big overhaul and reform, and that's effectively where I got to in my thinking. But what sat behind my report, I took the opportunity to land some bigger picture recommendations to government. Firstly, that the government should engage seriously in strategic workforce planning, which is the title of this presentation. And by that I mean thinking seriously about what workforce do we need in the future, when do we need it, where do we need it, and what is the skill profile of that workforce. And my gut feeling is that we're not very good at that. I think there's a lot of, you know, you'll hear figures talked about. I think I constantly hear this figure of 240,000 workers by 2030 or whatever. Most of it comes from things like the Construction Skills Network research that CITB does. And, you know, all well and good, you know, that's got logic to it, but I don't think it's sophisticated enough to really project what we're going to need in the future, in the detail, and sensitivity test it for changes that are happening out there. Again, which I'll come on to in a second. We also have an absorption problem. I don't actually think we have an attraction problem as much as everyone talks about. There's lots of young kids lining up to come into our industry. We can't absorb them. So actually the challenge is how do we create pathways, and maybe beyond apprenticeships, that enable people to come into our industry en masse, and actually enable the employers to absorb them with a commercial benefits case for doing that. Because coming back to this point about not wanting to load up your payroll, not wanting to take too many people on, we need to square that circle if we're going to resolve some of the issues we have around getting our numbers up. We also need to take a whole of workforce approach. So this is very much around not just concentrating on the new entrants, but working out what the reskilling needs of the standing incumbent workforce. That's a huge challenge. In the UK, we have about 2 million people in the industry. So actually the biggest skills challenge we have is actually that 2 million people. You know, we have a lot of things going on at the moment. I mean, people that have been in the industry for, in some instances, a long period of time need to learn new skills. It's really difficult to get to them, particularly when you have things like high levels of self-employment and people not in the skills system or in the employment system in a way that they can be influenced. One way of doing that is to introduce skills passporting. So I'm an advocate of moving towards a digital skills passport, which credentialises what everyone's competencies is on a live basis, and using it as a tool to ensure that everyone is up to speed with what they need to know to do their job. And this is an emotive subject as well, because there's obviously a bigger debate about digital ID going on at the moment, but I think for construction and for our workforce challenges, we need to start facing into this. People talking about digital product passports, trying to get assurance on how products and materials are coming to site. It's the same with people. There's no point having passported materials if they're put in incorrectly because people don't have the skills. We also need to get much better at aligning our relative devolved government skill systems. So between England and Scotland, there's quite a lot of difference. Doesn't help with mobility of labour, doesn't help with just general alignment of what actually should be a common goal. There's no real difference in England and Scotland in terms of what the need is. We need to get a lot more aligned. And lastly, we need to use public money and procurement rules, including planning, much more intelligently to drive skills outcomes. So at the moment, there's planning conditions that might come about to talk about local apprentices employment. My personal experience is they're pretty ineffective. Postcode apprentices, you might have heard that term. And there's a lot of money being given out by government, and there's a lot of government work where government's the client that don't mandate sufficiently enough skills outcomes. So all of these recommendations I made quite heavily to government at the beginning of this year when my report was published. We also have a lot of change going on at the moment. So both in Scotland and in England, there's a whole series of things going on around changing policy environment, institutional environment. So you have, here in Scotland, you have to move from apprenticeships, moving from Skills Development Scotland to Scottish Funding Council, SFC. In England, we've just had Skills England move from DFE to DWP, Department of Work and Pensions. We've had a white paper published in the last week. New sort of skills landscape, V-levels, foundation apprenticeships, whole load of stuff going on. Opportunity and a threat. That if we get that wrong, we're potentially going to go backwards. So it's really important that in this period of volatility, we make the most of change and do things that are going to be long-term benefits for the industry. We also have some threats around direction of travel for decarbonisation. So it's quite clear the politics of green and net zero is under pressure at the moment. There's a lot of talk, and some of it's around populist politics, that is putting pressure on whether politicians have the backbone to commit long-term to the targets they've signed up to. So we need to be wary of that. Hopefully these things will blow over and we'll continue doing what we're doing. We have legal commitments, but the reality is this is a big issue. It's great to see that Scotland is actually leading the way, despite that sort of fairly gloomy picture I pointed to in terms of the challenges. Scotland is doing some great work, and that's why it's always good to be up here to celebrate that. A lot of the work Best is doing is right at the heart of that, whether it's the low carbon passport, upskilling regime, pathways to productivity, involvement for the Scottish CLF. All of these things indicate that Scotland's on it, which is really, really good. And you have some real benefits around the fact that you have an industry embedded in timber framing, so you have an industrialisation heritage, you have your own homegrown timber, which Best again is trying to exploit. You have Best itself as an institution really banging the drum. You have things like the Edinburgh Homes Demonstrator as a piloting initiative. You have some great institutions where skills and training is coming to the forefront. You've got SMEs like Forster Group, and the work that John does I think is fantastic in terms of showing what skills and investment in young kids can do if you decide to do it. It's all about a leadership challenge. And you have a building regulation, building warrant regime, which is much easier than England's. So from a building safety and from a net zero perspective, there's much more stability and much more deliverability. My sort of closing part of the presentation is really about a change that's coming around skills, which is about this. Everyone's talking about AI at the moment. Most of what I've just said, you would characterise the skills issues about being site-based skills. Bricklayers, carpenters, plumbers, etc. The reality is there's something else happening out there that affects the broader built environment and construction workforce. It's difficult to work out what's real and what's hype at the moment. You look at all the headlines, you're not quite sure whether this is a bubble, but my sort of honest opinion, this is happening. It's actually already happening and it's coming and it's going to have a big impact. Some people think the only people that will be safe from this impact will be plumbers. Who knows? But I just think we've got something that's quite an interesting challenge. It's an opportunity as well, because everything that's great about our industry is about the people in it and the application of human endeavour. But also all the things that we struggle with as an industry is down to exactly the same thing: human endeavour misapplied. So the competency challenge we have, which is really what that statement's about, plus the fact that HR burdens are increasing, so just employing people is becoming more difficult, the cost of it's becoming more difficult. We have actually lots of people moving around the industry and being promoted and giving pay rises, not all of which is warranted, and people are being over-promoted. You know, that's an uncomfortable thing to say, but that's the reality. And we have wage inflation not match my productivity, means there's a lot of business owners out there and CEOs saying, what's this AI thing? I'm really interested in that. If I don't have to keep employing people, and this is particularly relevant for white-collar workers, I'm talking about here rather than site-based workers, they're getting quite interested to see how they can engage with it. So that's a threat and it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to be more productive with a finite workforce and to use technology in a good way. This is a report some of you will be aware of from the World Economic Forum. I'm not going to go into the detail, but the crux of it is there's a reskilling challenge around everyone that is out there at the moment in a knowledge-based, data-led job is going to have some kind of impact, and they need to understand AI and technological literacy. Don't have to code. It's about things like prompt engineering. It's about understanding how you deal with large language models and then assure the answer in a professional way, so it actually becomes a marriage between human expertise and professionalism and technology. This is happening, so this is not the future, this is the real. So whether it's Balfour's using Copilot at scale, whether it's JOL using their data analytics platform, or it's the government actually digitalising the planning system. AI is here, so this is real. And I suppose my inference is that this could be a good thing in that it might actually have a broader impact on business models and commercial models, which is one of the things we've struggled with as an industry to really unlock, going back to skills and investment and doing things differently. Could we actually end up in a position where AI is the change driver we've been missing for so long? You know, we thought MMC may well be that change driver, certainly in the last 5-10 years. Hasn't happened, mostly because of the downturn in the market I told you about. But when you're in a world of accessible, affordable kit that can be deployed on sites, and also in a way in which it might even disrupt the off-site manufacturing model in terms of the economics of using robotics with conventional materials, then there's threat and opportunity. And I think it remains to be seen how this lands, but we should all be preparing for it. And we need to obviously recognise it's in the hands to an extent of regulators, including government, professional indemnity insurers, to be comfortable with the progress that's being made around the adoption of AI. The reason I mention all of this is back to skills and back to strategic workforce planning. I don't believe some of the forecasts that I see, particularly around the white-collar part of our industry, actually. So one of the things I'd want to leave you with is that sort of sense that if we're going to do strategic workforce planning right, we need to really be robust around the assumptions we're making around the things that are going to change the way that we work, particularly in the professional managerial aspects. And the reason this is so important is because everyone thinks productivity in our industry is a function of the people at the workplace on the site, the bricklayers and carpenters not being productive enough. The reality is it starts all the way back with senior people at client organisations, consultants, advisors, contractors who are construction managing, all the way ahead of the people doing the work that cascades down to actually ending up giving that productivity challenge to the people on site. If we can use technology in a way that it helps us do our jobs better, then we resolve that and we become more competent. We resolve threats like what happened at Grenfell. We become a safer industry, a more assured industry, and we should really seek to grasp that. So my concluding comment really is that we need to avoid thinking the future looks like the past. We need to avoid straight line extrapolations, and my view is that we can embrace the opportunity going forward in a positive way, which will help with the skills challenge that we currently have. Thank you.
got a drink of water. So now this is your opportunity to ask Mark some questions as well. So if you have Slido, if you want to use that, we'll start bringing the questions in. Mark, just to get things kicked off, that was a fascinating presentation. You covered so many different areas. It was really hard to pick some topics. But I'm going to go back to you mentioned about the high-vis bingo and housing is high on the political agenda right now. Do you feel that it's having a substantial impact? Everyone is talking about it. Are you seeing that move into policy?
Yes, but it seems to be glacial in terms of progress. So, even yesterday, you may have seen Rachel Reeves giving her sort of statement that no one quite knows what it was, but it was sort of warming people up for bad news in the budget. But one of the things that came out of that was a sense that we're going to see another stimulus package for house building. And that's what the house builders have been lobbying for. That again is a sort of an emotive subject. Lots of people don't agree with having demand side stimuli. The reality is the house builders will not build unless they think they can sell their units. And if the government want to see house building numbers go up, they can't just deregulate planning. They need to do something on the demand side. And I think they're now getting panicked into thinking they have to do that. So I think the fact that the house building sector in particular, probably more so of all the other construction sectors, even more than infrastructure, I'd say, is front and centre of government's thinking. It's quite clear that the pressure coming from number 10, number 11 Downing Street, and it's the same mirrored here in Scotland, when there's a declared housing emergency, is such that we've got to get building again.
Yeah. Okay. Yep, just remind everyone, please start asking your questions and we'll get onto those as well in a second. I don't think there's any arguments from anyone in this room that construction in the built environment is vital to the UK's success. But you touched on the skills aspect there, and while attracting people in the industry isn't maybe quite as bad as we think, but retaining them and getting them through. How do we address that issue? How do we encourage everyone to see that this is a great industry and there are careers available, there are opportunities?
Yeah, so I think we need to be more organised in terms of how we present ourselves. So there's a lot of all good intentions, people out there doing things off their own back, where perhaps we're showcasing different versions of what our industry is about. We're also not very integrated around our thinking. I'm a great believer in not presenting the construction industry, but more the built environment industry, holistically, which includes all the other related professions. It's not just about construction, it's about planning, it's about the law related to real estate, it's about facilities management. And I just think if we were to be really joined up and present across the whole spectrum of careers, from trades to white collar technical roles, across all of those various parts of the spectrum, we'd be able to paint a much more effective picture and move it away from sometimes the construction bit just gets characterised as being a bit Bob the Builder, the going into the junior school and with a talk, a PPE and a toolkit and basically trying to promote the stereotype that is not what we want. We want kids to think that construction and built environment practice is modern and it's an attractive career.
All right, great, thank you. Now, so you see the Slido questions coming through. Thank you for those who put them in and for upvoting as well. Top one at the minute is from Nicola Barclay. Can you share your views on the challenges of attracting a more diverse workforce?
Yeah, well, so I suppose it's sort of a build on what I just said, really. We need to be projecting the narrative of what our industry is in a much more effective way. We need to be doing that earlier, I think, in terms of a lot of people come into the industry by default. They may, particularly on site-based workers, they might have failed GCSEs or whatever and end up in construction because that's where the careers advisor said, go into building, you'll always get a job there. And, I don't think that's a good advert for the industry. Needs to be more aspirational. It needs to be something that is seen as, a career of choice. The problem from a diversity perspective, we have issues. We definitely have issues around gender, particularly at site. Site level gender balance, I think we're only sort of in 2 to 3% female. That's a massive lost opportunity. Even in professional services, I think we're running at 15 to 20%. That needs to be, massively different. And it's the same with ethnicity as well. So, I think, the reality is there's a little bit of chicken and egg as to how we be more inclusive and how we we present ourselves in a way that isn't seen as putting people off, that we're just going to have more of the same. It's not an easy one to crack, but ultimately it's about ambassadors, it's about role models, it's trying to actually project ourselves in a different way.
Okay, thank you. Got time maybe for one or two more. An anonymous one. What can we learn from foreign construction markets and cultures?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I spent a lot of time travelling and going to different parts of the world and seeing, what's wrong, what's the same, and what's different. I would say there's more things that are the same than different. So, a lot of the issues we have in the UK, particularly around skills and training, are common to most developed economies. I don't see any sort of standout country that's doing something radically different, that's nailing it. They all have varying degrees of success. Even, a lot of people talk about Germany, for instance, as being the sort of exemplar for the apprenticeship system. But to be quite honest, what I hear from Germany, even Germany struggling with getting kids to do vocational roles, and they have a shortage of construction workers, much the same as we have here. There's some interesting stuff done in countries that perhaps have a bit more of an autocratic approach. So Singapore has got a really interesting skills system where they've basically they've made a decision as to what they need to do, and they're getting on to doing it. Hong Kong is the same, China effectively. It's obviously very different circumstances, but it's a little bit of a bookend as to if you had the mandate and you just wanted to do something with a structured autocratic approach, it can be done, but it may not suit a democratic system. So.
Right, great. Well, Mark, I think thank you for everyone. The questions we were out of time, and we could have spoken all day on this, but thank you so much. And everyone, please give me a huge round of applause to Mark.